History teaches us that revolutions are led by seasoned generals, battle-hardened warriors, visionaries who've spent decades preparing for their moment. History, as it turns out, lies by omission. Because in the winter of 1347, in the merchant city-state of Siena, the most unlikely revolution in medieval history was commanded by a 12-year-old girl named Lucia di Montieri. And before you dismiss this as legend or exaggeration, understand this: she didn't just participate in a revolution, she engineered it, she led it, and she won. This is her story, the one they erased from the chronicles because it made too many powerful men look like fools. Lucia wasn't born into nobility. She was the daughter of a wool merchant, comfortable but unremarkable. What made her remarkable was something her father noticed when she was barely 7 years old. While other children played with dolls, Lucia played with numbers. She would sit in her father's shop, watching him calculate prices, manage inventory, coordinate shipments across 3 cities. And one day, she quietly pointed out an error in his ledgers that would have cost him a year's profit. Her father, Alessandro, was no fool. He began teaching her everything, not just arithmetic, but logistics, negotiation, the intricate web of trade routes and political alliances that kept Siena wealthy. By age 10, Lucia was effectively running portions of her father's business. By 11, other merchants were consulting her on complex deals. Her mind worked differently. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, solutions where others saw obstacles.
Then came the plague. The Black Death arrived in Siena like a thief in the night, and it stole without mercy. Within 3 months, half the city was dead or dying. Lucia's mother, her 2 younger brothers. Her father lasted longer, but the sickness took him too, leaving Lucia alone at age 12 with a modest inheritance and a mind that refused to stop calculating. What she calculated was terrifying. Siena was collapsing. Not just from plague, but from the vultures circling it. The ruling oligarchy, 9 wealthy families who'd controlled the city for generations, were using the chaos to seize property, hoard food supplies, and consolidate power. They'd shut the grain stores, claiming shortage, while secretly selling surplus to neighboring cities at inflated prices. People were starving, while the 9 feasted. Lucia stood in the Piazza del Campo one morning and watched a mother beg for bread to feed her children. A guard from the 9 struck the woman down, laughing. Something in Lucia's chest went cold and hard as iron. She was 12 years old. She had no army, no authority, no right to challenge the most powerful families in Siena. What she had was a merchant's network, a mathematician's mind, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Lucia began with information. She spent 2 weeks moving through the city's lower quarters, the tanners, the blacksmiths, the servants who worked in the 9's households. She listened more than she spoke. She learned where the real grain stores were hidden. She learned which guards were tired of serving cruel masters. She learned which merchant families resented being squeezed by the oligarchs. She mapped the entire power structure of Siena in her head, finding every weak point, every pressure point, every leverage point. Then she called a meeting. In a tanner's workshop after dark, 43 people gathered: craftsmen, minor merchants, a few sympathetic minor nobles, and one very small girl who spoke with absolute authority. "The 9 are bleeding Siena dry," she said without preamble. "They're selling our grain while we starve. They're seizing properties from plague victims before the bodies are cold. They've turned our tragedy into their profit, and they're doing it because we're too afraid and too disorganized to stop them." A blacksmith named Paulo laughed bitterly. "We're commoners. What can we do against 9 families with private armies?" "We can outthink them," Lucia replied. "They have soldiers, but soldiers need to be paid. They have wealth, but wealth is just paper and promises. They have power, but power is just the collective agreement that they should have it. and I can break every single one of those things without raising a sword."
She unfurled a map of Siena and began explaining her plan. It was audacious, it was brilliant, it was absolutely insane. The Nine controlled the grain stores, so Lucia would create new ones. She'd already identified 7 merchant families willing to pool resources and secretly purchase grain from Florence at fair prices. She'd identified warehouses the Nine didn't monitor. Within a week, she could establish an alternative supply network. The Nine controlled the city guard, so Lucia would make the guard irrelevant. She'd mapped which neighborhoods were loyal to the people versus the oligarchs. Those neighborhoods would form their own watch, protecting the alternative markets. The Nine controlled the money supply through their banking houses, so Lucia would introduce a barter system and promissory notes backed by the merchant coalition. Money only has power if people agree it does. She'd simply create a parallel economy. "You want to start a shadow government," an elderly merchant named Vittorio said slowly, right under their noses. "Not a shadow government," Lucia corrected, "a real one. The one that actually feeds people, protects them, serves them. And when the people realize they don't need the Nine anymore, the Nine will realize they don't have power anymore. Revolutions don't require violence if you make the old system irrelevant." She was 12 years old, and she was proposing economic warfare that wouldn't be formally theorized for another 400 years. They thought she was mad, but they were desperate, and desperation makes people willing to follow even a child who speaks with certainty. The plan launched 3 days later. The alternative grain market opened in the Porta Romana district. Prices were fair, actually fair, not the extortionate rates the Nine charged. Word spread like wildfire. Within hours, hundreds of people were buying from Lucia's network instead of the official stores. The Nine responded exactly as Lucia predicted, with violence. They sent guards to shut down the market and arrest the merchants, but Lucia had positioned her people perfectly. The moment the guards entered the district, bells rang. Every door closed, every window shuttered. The guards found themselves in hostile territory, where even the stones seemed to reject them. No violence was needed. The guards simply couldn't function in a neighborhood that refused to acknowledge their authority. The Nine sent more guards. Lucia opened more markets in other sympathetic districts. The Nine tried to arrest the merchants supplying her network. Lucia had already prepared legal defenses, minor nobles she'd recruited who could tie up arrests in Siena's bureaucratic courts for months. Every move the Nine made, Lucia anticipated and countered. It was like watching a chess grandmaster play against amateurs. She was always 3 moves ahead, always repositioning before they knew where to strike. Within a month, 40% of Siena was buying from Lucia's network. The Nine's official markets were increasingly empty. Their authority was evaporating like morning mist. And that's when they made their fatal mistake. The head of the Nine, a vicious nobleman named Rinaldo Salimbeni, decided to make an example. He had his guards raid one of Lucia's warehouses, seize the grain, and execute 2 of the merchants on charges of sedition. He thought fear would break the revolution. Instead, he gave Lucia exactly the martyrdom she needed. Lucia called for a gathering in the Piazza del Campo at noon the next day. The Nine assumed it was a surrender. They were so confident they allowed it. 10,000 people showed up, nearly a third of Siena's surviving population. They filled the plaza, spilled into every adjacent street, packed so tightly that movement was impossible. And in the center, standing on a merchant's cart so she could be seen, was a 12-year-old girl. They murdered Stefano and Giovanni yesterday. Good men, honest men. They were killed for the crime of feeding hungry people. The Nine claim they rule by divine right, by tradition, by law. But let me ask you, what law says children should starve while granaries overflow? What tradition says we must bow to men who profit from our suffering? What divine right allows them to murder us for helping each other?
Her voice dropped, became intimate despite the crowd. I'm 12 years old. I have no army, no noble blood, no ancient claim to power. What I have is this. I know how to feed you. I know how to organize supply chains that don't exploit you. I know how to create systems that serve people instead of dominating them. And I know that every single one of you has more power than you realize. She raised her hand, pointing at the palazzo where the 9 watched from windows. They're 9 men in a building. You're 10,000 in a plaza. They have guards, maybe 500. You are the people who feed those guards, clothe them, house them, raise their children. Who has power here, really? The silence was electric. Then someone shouted, "What do you want us to do?" Lucia smiled. "Nothing violent, nothing that gives them excuse to call us criminals. I want you to simply stop. Stop working for them, stop buying from them, stop acknowledging their authority. For 1 week, we act as if the 9 don't exist. We run Siena ourselves through the networks we've already built. We prove we don't need them, and then we negotiate their surrender from a position of strength." It was a general strike, though that term wouldn't exist for centuries, and it was led by a child who'd studied logistics and turned it into a revolutionary weapon. The strike began the next morning. Every servant in the 9's households walked out. Every craftsman who'd supplied them closed their shops. Every merchant who'd paid them fees stopped paying. The city guard, unpaid and unsupported, simply went home. Within 3 days, the 9 were alone in their palazzos with no food, no servants, no protection, and no authority. Rinaldo Salimbeni tried to flee the city. He was stopped at the gates, not by force, but by a simple refusal. The gatekeepers said, "No." He threatened them with execution. They shrugged. "By whose authority?" they asked. "You're just a man. We don't work for you anymore." On the 6th day, the 9 sent a messenger to Lucia requesting terms of negotiation. She was playing dice with a group of street children when the messenger arrived. She barely looked up. "Tell them these terms. They surrender all claims to special governance. They return seized properties to rightful owners or heirs. They open their personal grain stores for public distribution at fair prices. They accept a new city council with representation from all guilds and districts. And they do this publicly in the Piazza del Campo with a signed charter. They have until sunset tomorrow." The messenger stammered. "And if they refuse?" Lucia rolled her dice, studying the result. "Then we continue pretending they don't exist until they starve or leave. I can wait. Can they?" The 9 signed the charter the next day, all 9 of them standing in the Piazza del Campo before thousands of witnesses, formally surrendering their oligarchic power and accepting a new Republican council. It was the most peaceful revolution in medieval history. No battles, no siege, just relentless strategic brilliance from a 12-year-old girl who understood that power is just a collective illusion that stops working when people stop believing in it.
Lucia was offered a seat on the new council. She refused. "I'm 12, she said simply. "I'll advise, but I won't rule." That's what got the 9 in trouble, thinking they should rule forever. Power should circulate like blood, not stagnate like a pond. She spent the next 3 years helping establish Siena's new government, then quietly stepped away. By 15, she was just another merchant's daughter, managing a successful textile business. She married at 18, had 4 children, lived to the respectable age of 63, and died in her sleep surrounded by grandchildren. The Republican Council she forced the 9 to accept became the model for Siena's government for the next century. The idea that authority comes from service rather than force, that was her gift to a world that wasn't ready to credit a 12-year-old girl with political genius. Lucia di Montieri proved something revolutionary, that strategic brilliance has no age requirement. That true leadership isn't about commanding armies, it's about understanding systems and knowing which pressure points will make them transform. That sometimes the most dangerous revolutionary is a child who looks at the world without accepting that this is how it's always been is a reason for anything.
She was 12 years old, and she overthrew an oligarchy without violence, without an army, without any traditional source of power. She did it with intelligence, organization, and the radical belief that people deserved better than what they'd accepted. History forgot her because she made powerful men look foolish, but her legacy lives in every moment someone realizes they don't have to accept unjust authority. In every general strike, in every peaceful revolution that wins through organization rather than violence. Lucia di Montieri, the child commander who led a revolution by making tyranny irrelevant. Her message across the centuries: age doesn't determine wisdom, tradition doesn't justify injustice, and power only exists where people grant it. Question everything, build alternatives, and never accept that you're too young, too small, or too powerless to change the world. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword. It's a 12-year-old who knows how to count and refuses to accept that hunger makes sense when warehouses are full.